So I'm just gonna delve right into my questions first. So the first thing I'm gonna ask you is, what initially sparked your interest in studying and taking psychedelics? And then how did that evolve into documenting yourself studying, making, and using psychedelics?
I've always been interested in drugs since I was a young child, since I was in kindergarten, actually, because I think they're very interesting. I'm sort of surprised that it's even a question. It's sort of like asking someone why they would be interested in music or something like that. I think that it's almost self-evident to most people that drugs are very interesting, but it's usually colored by some kind of value about how they're dangerous or associated with social problems of one kind or another. And I was always just impressed by the fact that they even exist and how powerful they are. And yeah, I mean, I remember watching the news as a child and hearing about fatal drug overdoses and thinking like, wow, that's amazing. That's even possible. Like just the idea that it was possible was very impressive to me. But yeah, and then in terms of psychedelics, I think that they are one of the more interesting classes of psychoactive drugs due to their strange effects on psychology and their history and all the different cultures that have used them in different ways. I mean, I think all psychoactive drugs are very interesting. I'm not a drug elitist that thinks that psychedelics are inherently better than other classes of drugs, but from a storytelling perspective, I think that they attract a lot of really interesting people. And so when I was making my show, there was no shortage of weird stories to tell about people that studied psychedelics in one way or another.
Super interesting. And then I guess kind of propelling from that question, are there any longstanding myths about psychedelics, even as they are now sort of slowly but surely becoming more socially, culturally accepted for their medicinal benefits that you would like to debunk or feel should be debunked?
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so many. There's too many. I could just go on endlessly about all of the misconceptions. I feel like there's more misconceptions than there are accurate assessments of psychedelics. But I mean, there's so many things. Right now, I think that an overestimation of the entourage effect has become a very prominent thing in the psychedelic community, which is kind of, I think, like a misplaced spiritual interpretation of the psychedelic experience, but rooted through a materialist framework where instead of having some kind of animist understanding that plants have spirits or something, now the spirits have become terpenes or trace quantities of beta carbolines or something like that. So I see that a lot with the discussion of mushrooms, is like people, it also of course happens with cannabis primarily, but people seem sort of reluctant to acknowledge that psilocybin is what is mediating this experience, or psilocin, and they want to invoke like 1 femtogram of harmine or harman that was found in one study in the mycelium of one species. So that's something I've been seeing a lot of. But yeah, there's so many. I mean, I think also the idea that synthetic drugs are bad is a problematic view from a conservation standpoint, because psychedelics are rapidly becoming so much more popular. And so it's really important for people to cultivate the most sustainable relationships with them that they possibly can. And so, you know, specifically with Bufo alvarius, there's a huge demand for the venom, and that's, you know, that's a big problem. But it's derived from this idea that the venom contains special components that make it superior to synthetic 5-MeO-DMT, and that really just has not been validated in any kind of meaningful way. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of misconceptions.
Well, with 5-MeO-DMT, I saw a video where you were synthesizing it and discussing how you felt that was the way forward because of the scarcity of the frogs and the sort of like potential like hoarding of the frogs, or
yeah.
And so in that sense, do you feel then that the way forward is needs to be synthesis in order to preserve the frogs that are like naturally emitting it.
Yeah, or something similar to it. I suppose there are other possibilities, like there's a group maybe in Hungary that is cultivating them, which I think is possible. Then there's the question of whether it's ethical to keep these toads captive in order to harvest their venom.
Right.
There's also a more recent discovery. There's a group in Chicago that has created a kind of cell culture that supposedly produces the full spectrum of components that are naturally present in the venom. So that's a really nice intermediate between synthesis and harvesting toad venom.
Cool.
I mean, but like part of me also thinks it's a little bit weird because the other components in the venom are cardiotoxic steroids. And so the introduction, like expending resources to introduce toxic components to this product seems like a bad idea to me. But the reality is that people really seem to have this idea that it has to be a mixture of things. It can't be isolated 5-MeO-DMT. So there are people that are very hard to convince otherwise. And it also has advantages from a precision dosing standpoint because it's such a potent psychedelic. I think it's really valuable to be able to weigh the dose and measure it as carefully as possible in order to minimize the chance of adverse reactions to it.
That's a good point. I think this is taking a slightly different direction, but just because we're sort of talking about synthetic versions of drugs being created, it feels a little bit relevant. A question I had was sort of how can we balance sort of like the capitalistic intentions of people as psychedelics, like regarding like enterprising psychedelic businesses, while still like maintaining the integrity of the substances and the sort of like medicinal benefits behind them. So like how do you, as it sort of shifts into becoming something that might be like more accessible or used more frequently to treat, say, like mental health conditions, how do you
Well, psychedelics have always been sold pretty much in every culture that I've seen. Money is exchanged for them. So I don't think that having a exchange of money for a psychedelic necessarily negates their benefits.
Sure.
And I think that there are all sorts of problems that hypothetically could emerge. I haven't really seen evidence that they exist, but of course, you know, if you have people that are making fraudulent claims about the medical properties of a psychedelic, and that's a problem. And that already happens without a medical framework. That's happening right now and has happened for a long time. So I don't think that necessarily is a product of medical approval or the progress that's been seen in the psychiatric sphere with psychedelics.
I guess leading off of that, when people are purporting psychedelics to be a cure-all or doing kind of what you're saying and sort of being like projecting falsehoods about their benefits, do you think that there's a thing that, you know, those who are interested in it or researching it or just as a society that we can do to sort of circumvent that?
It's, well, in a, you know, fully regulated FDA approved product, then there would be legal limitations on what sorts of claims could be made. In a legalized or decriminalized economy, which I support, there's more opportunity for people to make those sorts of claims depending on the state regulations. And it's tricky because I think when people talk about this, they always assume that it's being done in some kind of cynical way. But the reality is that the full potential of psychedelics have not been adequately explored. And it's really easy for people to start thinking, well, maybe it is a treatment for Alzheimer's disease. Maybe it is a treatment for Parkinson's disease. And they maybe give it to someone and maybe they have a little bit of an effect and they think, oh yeah, it would be irresponsible not to recommend this as a treatment. And so there's a lot of wishful thinking. And that's not to say these are bad people, but it definitely could become a problem. I mean, like, for example, the use of ibogaine to treat Parkinson's is something that happens at a lot of unregulated clinics in Canada and Mexico. And I was very interested in that when I first heard about it, and I started interviewing the people at the clinics and trying to speak with patients about their experiences, because I thought, well, this is remarkable. And there is even a hypothetical mechanism through which ibogaine could exert an anti-Parkinson's effect, because it releases this neurotrophic factor, GDNF. So it's not, which is known to have an anti-Parkinson's effect. So it's not unbelievable that such a thing could happen. But the reality was that no one was rigorously studying any of this, and they weren't doing placebo controls, obviously. And so you have a handful of anecdotal reports, which are not useless, but they're also not evidence that this is safe or effective as a medicine. And then you have people that have a chronic neurodegenerative disease that are desperate, and the interplay of those things can be dangerous. I mean, this also, of course, happens with fraudulent cancer treatments.
Right. And in that same vein, then, I'm curious if you feel that when it comes to psychedelic research, similarly, I guess, to, like you said, using ibogaine to treat Parkinson's, but say when they're conducting, here at Hopkins, we've done some studies on psilocybin to treat, depression, or to, they're about to start, I think, to look at like smoking cessation. When you're doing those sorts of clinical trials, do you think that there are people who should not be eligible? Like, I guess, are there people who should not be eligible to do that based off of, say, something like a mental health history, or, a prior condition of some sort? Or if it's not limiting it based off of that, like, what do you think is the best way to gauge who should and should not be taking psychedelics in clinical settings, or also recreationally even?
Right. Yeah, it really comes down to how conservative and cautious people want to be. William Leonard Picard actually talks about this a bit, and he says that historically in the black market with LSD, the idea was that you never give LSD to somebody who's mentally ill. You don't give it to somebody who's depressed. You don't give it to somebody who is even going through just some kind of psychological turmoil, like a breakup, because those are people that are more likely to have adverse effects from using a psychedelic. You give it to healthy people, and it will better their lives in one way or another. And that's fundamentally at odds with the medical model that exists in the United States, which is that drugs are only dispensed for treatment of disease. It's the complete opposite. You categorically have to give them to people who are unwell. And so that does open up the possibility that people will have negative effects. And there was a little bit of that observed in the Compass phase 2b psilocybin trial with people with treatment-resistant depression. Right. And so that's something that I think people should be aware of. And it just comes down to really the same ideas that underlie the use of any investigational medicine. Do the risks outweigh the benefits? Is it appropriate to do this? I think there are ways to cautiously probe these things. And it also, of course, was done extensively in the 1960s. It's not as if people haven't given LSD to people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. And so it's just a question of, are people going to go back down that road and see if it has any value? I think right now, because there's also, it's not purely medical, this doesn't exist in a vacuum. There are all sorts of political implications to this research, because journalists are constantly writing about it, everyone's looking at it. And so everybody who's involved in this sort of work wants things to go well. And that's why, for the most part, the studies that have been done here and elsewhere have been sort of conservative in their application of these things, and have gone after the indications that seem most likely to respond positively to psychedelic therapy. Like, obviously, MDMA for PTSD would be an example where it makes a lot of sense that that would work. But there's a number of other things that MDMA conceivably could exert a therapeutic effect for. It's just a question of, is now the time to investigate that?
Right. Well, since you mentioned MDMA, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Alexander Shulgin, because you were the last person who got to speak with him, I believe.
I was not the last, but I did an interview with him. That was one of the last interviews. Yeah.
Right. So when you spoke with him, I was curious what insights or ideas you took away from him that you feel are maybe really poignant and worth sharing.
I spoke with him many times. And had the opportunity to spend a lot of time with him and at his house toward the end of his life. I was actually at his house visiting maybe 2 weeks ago, maybe less. And of course he's gone, but his wife is still alive, and she's writing. And there's just so much that he contributed. I wouldn't say that my personal interactions with him necessarily offered anything that isn't available to everyone in his published writing. Like he pretty much got it out there in TCAL and PCAL and in his many scientific papers and talks. So there wasn't, some kind of personal exchange that fundamentally changed the way I viewed his work. He was really prolific, and there's no shortage of material that he left behind that people can use to inform themselves about his work.
No, absolutely. What was it, I guess then, what was it like interacting with him rather than like how was he and what was he like as a person versus maybe how he, how his papers and writings.
I mean, he's a very funny, irreverent, gigantic person. He was extremely tall. He was a giant. Yeah, he was an amazing person who lived a very romantic life. I mean, his lab is a beautiful place to work. It's small, but it has everything that a chemist would need. And it's really inspiring going there. I mean, it still exists and people are still making psychedelics in that same lab to this day. His lab is now actually a pharmaceutical company, the Alexander Shulgin Research Institute, that is run by his protege, Paul Daly, as well as some other psychedelic chemists, Nick Cozy, who are really great people. And I know that Shulgin would have been very happy about what's happening to see his work continuing. And I've spoken with some people who felt that his lab should be converted into a museum or something like that. But I think that he would be pleased to know that that did not happen, that instead it's being used as a lab and people are still making new psychedelics. And that's something that he very much stood behind. That the work is never finished. There's an infinite number of these things, and who knows what will be found in the exploration.
Right. And so he sort of would be happier knowing that his legacy is that the work is continuing and evolving rather than that it's sort of his space has become just a place to remember what he did.
Yeah, I don't think he wanted, I think one of the things that he did so well was that he inspired other people to follow in his footsteps. And you can see this throughout PCAL and TCAL. He's not trying to keep things secret or claim intellectual territory and say, like, I call this area of research. He's advising people, I didn't do this. This is a good route to pursue. Maybe this is something that could yield interesting results. And so throughout those books, he's giving people little leads to follow. And when I was starting out doing chemistry, that was a lot of the work that I did. It was like, oh, Alexander Shulgin talked about 5-bromo-DMT, but he didn't do any work with it. I'll synthesize that. That should be interesting. And that was intentional on his part. And he talked to all sorts of people. That was kind of his thing, is that he was very responsive to people. He wanted to connect people and to keep that sort of research going.
Well, I think it sounds like he did an excellent job of paving the way for a lot of aspiring psychedelic researchers and chemists. So I'm sure, like you said, he would be very pleased with how things are going.
Yeah.
So that's great. I know you've been speaking a bit on social media and things about some psychedelic substances that are going to be prohibited, or it's seemingly are going to be prohibited. And I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, and sort of tell people like what the substances are and why they are, at risk or going to be made like illegal.
Yeah, the DEA is really going for it right now. It's weird. During the Trump administration, I don't think they prohibited a single psychedelic. And then Biden appointed a new head of the DEA, and they've been acting on all of these scheduling recommendations that were made in the very early 2000s. So these are recommendations from 2012 that were in response to events that occurred in 2002. So these are 20-year-old events that are now being, and I don't understand why now people are responding to these things. And on top of that, they are really weird choices. Not that I think any drug should be prohibited. I just don't think it's a good strategy for dealing with problems associated with drugs. Most of the most problematic drug trends in our culture are a direct product of prohibition. Like synthetic cannabinoids wouldn't have been 1/100th as popular as they were if cannabis were readily available and people weren't tested by probation officers and employers and things like that. So that emerged out of prohibition and urine analysis. And the same thing is true of fentanyl. And then they prohibit all the fentanyl derivatives, and then you get adenitazine derivatives, and it just keeps going. And then they prohibited the adenitazine derivatives, and there's going to be something else, bromidol derivatives, and it just keeps going. There's no end to it. And so they chose these 5 tryptamines initially: DIPT, 4-hydroxy-DIPT, 5-MeO-DET, 5-MeO-AMT, and 5-MeO-MIPT. None of which are prominent drugs of abuse at all. I mean, has anyone here even? Yeah, these are not.
I consider buying some just because they prohibited them.
Oh, there you go. Yeah. So yeah, it's really a weird choice, and they go through their logic in the recommendation, and it's really tricky because they make the rules. They have their criteria, and under their criteria, these things should be illegal, but their criteria are insane. Right. So it's really difficult to reason with them. And this is the first time that I have opposed a scheduling action from the DEA legally. And even doing that has been very difficult. I was lucky enough to work with a lawyer who has been representing me and Jason Wallach, the chemist that I work with. Even getting a hearing, which we were supposed to be legally entitled to, was immensely difficult. At first, they were saying that we hadn't adequately demonstrated harm associated with the scheduling action, because even though we carefully explained that we researched one of the drugs that is being prohibited and that it will interfere with our research, and they said, well, that's not enough of a problem. And they didn't seem to do that to the groups who had a commercial interest in the substances, which I found interesting. And it's kind of, yeah, it's like if you're just a scientist studying the stuff, they don't care. But if you're selling it, then they are somehow more sympathetic to your objection in terms of prohibiting it. So it's all really wacky trying to figure it out. And they're doing this also. I mean, there's a drug called amineptine. Has anyone heard of this? These are really obscure substances that they're placing in Schedule 1, same legal status as heroin. And in their recommendation, they acknowledge that it has never been found in the United States, that there is not a single recorded instance of anybody fatally overdosing on it. And then they said, but rodents self-administer this. And I looked at their citation; it doesn't even mention amineptine, and it's puzzling. I don't really know what to make of it because it's purposeless. Even from the perspective of increasing their power, I don't really see how it works on that level either, because it's not like, oh, now they have the freedom to arrest people for amineptine. Like, it's just weird. And I don't know why they're doing it. And I'm hoping that I will be able to prevent the prohibition of at least one of the 5 tryptamines. And I'm glad that there are other people who are opposing the remaining 4, including Matt Johnson at Johns Hopkins.
It is interesting that people who have a financial stake in something being legal or illegal seem to get, I guess, more floor time to advocate against it. That is.
Well, this is why I think medicalization is a good thing. Everyone is wringing their hands about, what if companies start selling the stuff and they make money off of it? But that's also how a group gains enough power to oppose these sorts of actions. When they were scheduling kratom, one of the major reasons that it didn't go through is there were a lot of industry lobbyists. There was real money behind the kratom industry, and they could fight it because it was an organized industry group. And the same is not true for 5-MeO MIPT.
Right.
I don't know that it ever will be true, but I think that once these things are approved as medicines, it will be more difficult for them to make some of these claims, because right now there is not a single FDA approved psychedelic medicine. And so there's nothing you can point to and say, hey, like, you know, psilocybin that binds to 5-HT2A and this is related, it conceivably could elicit the same therapeutic effect. So it's a weird time for them to be doing this. And then also they just announced that they're prohibiting DOI and DOC, also obscure psychedelics that are not prominent drugs of abuse. And DOI is one of the most commonly used 5-HT2A agonists in scientific research. So that's like, really feels like it's almost intended directly to hobble research on 2A. But I have no idea if that's what they're thinking or if it's just random, like ammoneptine. I don't know.
With having psychedelics become FDA approved forms of medicine, do you feel though that the pharmaceutical industry might be at odds with that even coming to be, or at odds with companies who are trying to distribute it, I guess, like once it gets into that realm? Because, you know, for example, like if you're treating depression, you can give someone Prozac every day, and that's, you know, is there more money to be made, I guess, in like the treatments that aren't psychedelics? Because with psychedelics, you do like 1 to 3 sessions, and then you typically walk away for an extended period of time before you ever delve back into it again.
Yeah, I mean, doing that sort of analysis is really tricky, and I don't have the figures available. I don't think anybody does.
Right.
This is something that insurance companies are going to be carefully scrutinizing. And I think this is actually one of the reasons that Compass pursuing treatment-resistant depression was a good move over Usona pursuing MDD, because I think in the case of MDD, because it is sort of like the entry-level depression diagnosis, that prescribers and insurers will be more inclined to prescribe the standard of care like Prozac, because it's cheaper, it's generic, it will cost the insurers less. But then by the time you have a more severe condition like treatment-resistant depression, the justification for a potentially more expensive treatment, I think, would be easier. But this is like totally speculative, what I'm saying. I don't know how this will actually play out. I mean, there's even psychedelic insurance companies that are emerging, like Enthea. They were recently talked about in the New York Times. And I think that they exist to mitigate these sorts of issues, but how many employers are going to pay for psychedelic insurance for their employees? I don't predict all that many, but who knows?
No, yeah, I know it's a very like, you know, it requires a lot of speculation to answer that question, but I was just curious what you thought.
Yeah, I don't think that there's like a concerted, I think that there's always this idea that the pharmaceutical company is behind prohibition, and there's this sort of calculated attempt to destroy these medicines so that they can make more money with ineffective medicines. I don't think that's really the way things work. I think that if something's effective, they just try to figure out a way to sell it and make money off of it that way.
Right.
It wouldn't be worth the effort for like, you know, big SSRI manufacturers to try to get 5-MeO MIPT prohibited because it poses a threat to the dominant SSRI mode of treating depression. But I mean, this is a claim that a lot of people have made with cannabis as well. And I don't think I haven't seen evidence that it's true, that there's been, maybe it occurred to some extent with tobacco, but I'm not totally sure about what kinds of like formal industry lobbying against cannabis have occurred with competing interests.
Yeah, my assumption was just that specifically with, say, psilocybin or something, that just because you administer very minimal sessions, just that it's harder to financially profit off of that in the same way as other methods. But I understand what you're saying for sure.
Yes, long term, although you can charge more upfront, and
Right.
there's certainly ways to make that a profitable model. I mean, it's also just gonna, it's gonna cost a lot more. I mean, it's really like a revolutionary idea, and it's gonna be amazing to watch it play out, because even drug facilitated psychotherapy, forget the whole psychedelic thing, just that alone is already something that doesn't exist in any treatment in the United States.
That's true. Well, with, I guess, facilitated drug treatment, I'm going to pivot ever so slightly, and this is my last question, and then I'm going to open it up to everybody else and all the people online as well. But I think it's been popular for a while now, but with all the people who are seeking out like psychedelic retreats and say going to other countries and engaging in, you know, an ayahuasca ceremony or something of that sort, do you have any personal tips or advice or just advice that you've gleaned from others on how to select those kinds of experiences and what to look out for in terms of what makes a good guide for that and what doesn't?
No, not at all. And I wouldn't do it personally. I don't trust any of these people. And every time I would profile somebody who is a sort of shaman type on my show, as soon as the show aired, someone would write to me and say, "How could you? Didn't you know that he did something to somebody?" And I'd say, "No, I didn't know." But it seems like in this unregulated environment, there is a lot of bad behavior. And I recognize that it's maybe frightening for some people to use psychedelics in a completely unguided context, but you know, it, like, from my personal perspective, I would prefer to do it without the guidance of a paid shaman type. But it really depends. You know, that's like a luxury that I have. You know, having studied these things for a long time and having thought about them a lot. For a lot of people, they just don't have the time or the interest to invest, you know, years into thinking about it. And especially if it's, you know, like an older person who may be suffering from depression, you can't expect them to develop some kind of encyclopedic knowledge of psychedelics and do it themselves or with a friend. So there is a need for those sorts of facilitators, but in terms of how to vet them, I do not have advice, really. I think that in a regulated medical framework, there will be, you know, I hope, ways of vetting people to ensure that they are behaving ethically. Although there already were issues with the MAPS trial, and yeah, I think your guess is as good as mine there.
I don't know why that wasn't the answer I was expecting, so it's really interesting.
Well, I mean, I don't know, is there a like database of, because it's really tricky. There's people that are making all kinds of, you just hear everything. You hear people that maybe are mentally ill in some way, making claims that maybe are unfair. And then you have people that are afraid to make claims, who feel silence. You have everything going on simultaneously. It's very, very tricky to figure this stuff out. And that's why I have always been cautious and not drawn to that sort of model, especially because it's totally unregulated in such a way that there's no real accountability. And of course, it, you know, there's some really disastrous instances, like what happened to Chimbre with Kyle Nolan, where he was murdered by a shaman, and the shaman buried him in the jungle and said that he walked away. And that was a shaman that lots of people really liked, thought he was a great guy, at least before this came out. And then after it became apparent that he'd murdered somebody, or at the very least had neglected them and they died and then buried their body surreptitiously, then everyone started coming out of the woodwork and saying, "Oh yeah, that Maestro Moncaluto, yeah, there was always something wrong with that guy. He didn't watch anyone. He'd go into a basement and claim that he was psychically monitoring the sessions, but none of that information was available to people until it was too late."
Well, does anyone in the, thank you. That was really, really interesting. And I hadn't actually heard about that case with the person passing away.
Yeah.
It's really, really terrible. But does anybody have any questions? Go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, so I had a question about, so when we think about sort of the very regulatory, rigid clinical environment, and then we think on the other hand, but maybe somebody like Alexander Shulgin was using scientific methods to explore these things, but it was more unrestricted and maybe more free flowing. Is there something that a regulatory environment can learn from sort of methods that Shulgin used, or would that be a problem for the could that cause a serious problem for the validity of more clinical regulated method to take these drugs and turn them into actual medicine?
I think it potentially would cause a problem in terms of the reproducibility of the therapeutic effect if people are doing completely different things. Although with other psychiatric drugs, that's the norm, right? People use them however they use them. It's not that they're being observed by a clinician who is ensuring that the environment is standardized, and if they're listening to music, the music is standardized, and the way that they interact is standardized. I mean, at this time, again, people are being as conservative as possible because the stakes are high and people really want this to end well. And so this makes sense as the most conservative approach, but there are also groups like there's a company, Tactogen, that's run by Matthew Baggett. He's a really brilliant guy. And he is, I think, interested in an alternate model where people get MDMA type serotonin releasers to take home and use in their own personal chosen environment. I also approve of that. I mean, I'm kind of a weird person to ask about this stuff because I have a very laissez-faire attitude. I almost feel like people should be able to do whatever they want, but in fact, I do feel that way. But the stakes are so high, and if something goes wrong, it will potentially have major implications in terms of regulation and all of the progress that we've currently seen. So there's a weird balancing act going on where people are almost intentionally curtailing the freedom in these trials as much as possible because they really don't want to introduce any kind of variables that could ruin everything that's been built.
Do we have any online questions, or should I just take more from there?
We do. We have a question
I'm thinking I'll
from,
just go back and forth if that's okay with everybody.
yep, we got a question from John. He asked, Hamilton, as a psychochemist, what do you make
A
of the fact-
psychochemist.
That's what's written here.
Okay.
What do you make of the fact that so many pharmacologically distinct psychoactive drugs, and he references 5-HT2A agonists, NMDA antagonists, monoamine, reuptake inhibitors, etc. What do you make of the fact that so many of these distinct drugs appear to elicit phenomenologically similar mystical type experiences?
What were the different types of drugs?
He referenced LSD, psilocybin, ketamine, PCP, MDMA, and ibogaine.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think it gets to the heart of what even the word psychedelic means, because you do have these chemically and pharmacologically distinct compounds like salvinorin A at the kappa opioid receptor, muscimol is a GABA agonist, PCP and ketamine is an NMDA antagonist, psilocybin and mescaline and LSD at 5-HT2A. So these are very dissimilar compounds that are all doing something that people feel comfortable calling psychedelic. And why that is, or what the heart of what a psychedelic drug is sort of hard to define. And I guess it's also questionable whether they're even truly similar, or how similar they are. There was a study done at Johns Hopkins where people had difficulty differentiating DXM and psilocybin, which I thought was really interesting. And these were not trained, but these were people who had a lot of prior experience with both of them. And anytime I reference the study, people say, oh, that's ridiculous. I can easily tell the difference. And that's because they think they could tell the difference. But when you actually study the stuff, it may not be so clear because there are these phenomenological similarities between the psychedelics. And I don't know if there is some kind of single explanation for what that is or why they are that way. Yeah, I don't know. Short answer, I don't know.
Go ahead.
Paul, hi Hamilton, big fan of the show. Good to meet you. You kind of touched on this earlier, I think, to the regulatory challenges that we're facing. And we're kind of all in the second psychedelic renaissance right now, and I'm just curious, with your experiences, what do you think like the biggest threat to that is at the moment? Because, you know, the first time around, the story goes that, you know, Nixon went down to the anti-war movement. Kind of curious, what do you think the risks are?
Well, that's one explanation. Another explanation that is not frequently offered is that the profit motive dried up. So around the time that Sandoz discontinued the manufacture of LSD, the reason that they cited was that there was clandestine synthesis of LSD. And so they were deciding to discontinue work with it, but also the patent had expired. And I think around that time, they were probably losing hope of ever commercializing it as a medicine. And so a major pharmaceutical company said, yeah, never mind about this stuff. And suddenly, what reason exists to not just prohibit them? And that's kind of a weird answer, but I do think that there is a protective effect in the commercialization of these things. I'm not saying that's the way it should be, but I do think it is the way it is. And so I think that all of these different companies, I know everyone's wringing their hands about this, but I think that this is actually a good thing. And that I think will have a protective effect. But in terms of what makes it vulnerable, I think infighting in the psychedelic community has become a really, really major problem, especially over these issues. It's become incredibly divisive. And the way the media responds to it, because journalists feed off of this conflict. A lot of journalists have built their careers off of covering this specific conflict. And are they going to sensationalize what's happening? What if something bad happens during a trial? How are people going to treat that? Are they going to treat it maturely, or are they going to sensationalize it? And that is a little bit hard to predict. I had the same concern when there were all these dramatic changes in cannabis policy in the United States, where I thought, okay, all it's going to take is just one stoned teenager hitting a pregnant woman, and that's it. It's all over. All the progress will be undone. And thankfully, there wasn't something like that. But that's the way it works. That's what happened in the Netherlands with psilocybin-containing mushrooms. There was one French tourist, Gael Karoff, who jumped off a bridge, and that was it. No more psilocybin-containing mushrooms in the Netherlands. Thankfully, there was a loophole which allowed them to sell the psilocybin-containing sclerotia, but it was just one person and a media frenzy over their death that wasn't even definitively linked to the use of psilocybin-containing mushrooms. So that's the other thing, is something bad doesn't even need to happen. They could just, if somebody pretends that something bad happened, that's enough. And we've seen that happen throughout American history as well, because it's a good story if somebody has something horrible happen to them on a drug. There was a journalist named Mark Bowl who wrote an article for Rolling Stone about the tragic death of a teenager who'd taken a drug called 2CT7 that was something that Alexander Shulgin considered one of the 6 greatest psychedelics that he'd created. And all it took was that story to come out in Rolling Stone. That's the end of 2CT7. So I think journalists often don't recognize their power and their responsibility and how much of an effect they can have negatively through telling what they think is just a juicy story. And I think that a lot of this infighting that has been extremely damaging has also been a product of opportunistic journalists and editors who like this story. I have a friend who's a journalist, and he was pitching various stories, and the editor said, well, I want, a good guy, bad guy story. We need a bad pharmaceutical company versus a good pharmaceutical company, because that's the story that's going to sell. And that's the way it works, unfortunately. I think it's also important for people to recognize that that's the way it works, so they can critically examine what is emerging in the press and not take it at face value. I mean, there's another example. I'm not going to call the guy out because I actually really like him personally, but he's a veteran of the psychedelic world. He's done a lot of great work, but he operates in a retreat model where people pay large sums of money, $10,000, somewhere in that vein, to go to Costa Rica and have a psilocybin-containing mushroom experience with him. And that's his business. And so a FDA-approved, insurance reimbursable medical model is a threat to his business. Now I see him writing all these articles like, can we really trust pharmaceutical companies to sell psychedelics? Isn't this going to be the next OxyContin? We need to think twice about medicalization. And I see all these people applauding this as if this is a really valuable, critical perspective, when first of all, it's absurd. And Secondly, this guy has an enormous conflict of interest. And I also have a conflict of interest as well. I should say that, you know, I work in a lab that receives funding from Compass. So, you know, I do approve this, and I think that it's also been really good for basic scientific research. So for me, it's been immensely positive, and I think that that is just the reality, but it's not really reflected in the way it's treated in most of the news coverage.
Should we do another online one?
Yeah. By the way, what I took away from that answer is that the media has a lot to do with the risk to the psychedelic renaissance, but also our individual actions. Like your example of the French tourist. I mean, it comes down to each one of us make smart choices.
Yeah, and it shouldn't be that way. Like, that's a stupid way for things to be, that one person making a mistake can be enough to destroy an entire avenue of research or categorically prohibit a chemical, but it is that way. So, yeah.
So we have another question from Patrick. He asks, from your perspective, what can we do to reduce the stigma around these substances? And he gives the specific example of the stigma around dissociatives.
Reduce the stigma. I mean, I think, you know, Carl Hart has done a lot of really good work in that vein of one thing is to be honest about your use and to not hide it, because that's, and I know that that's a tricky thing for a lot of people. So I don't say that lightly, thinking that everyone should just go out and do it, because there could be real repercussions for some people. And even I don't flaunt that all the time, because there are times when it's obviously inappropriate. But I think that openness is really, really important, and not hiding. This is, you know, one of the criticisms that I used to receive from people who would say, oh, how can you show that MDMA synthesis on your show? Now the government knows about it, and it's going to be ruined. And I understand where they're coming from with that sort of criticism, but that's really just a short-term strategy, is hiding. Hiding only works short-term. Long-term, you have to be open if you want to see actual change.
Does anybody else in the room have a question? Okay, we've got a couple people. Andrew?
Sorry, let me get a little bit here. So what do you believe are some of the novel factors to consider when prescribing psychedelics in a medical context? I know specifically with Ibogaine, people have started talking about life contracts, that if you get the chance during your experience to cross over to the other side, you won't take that. Are there any sort of other concerns behind, besides set or setting, that
And Shulgin used to do that as well.
really? Okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, can you repeat the question so that Zoom people can hear it? I doubt that they can hear people in the audience.
The ceiling has microphones.
Does it really?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Zoom folks, if you're having trouble hearing.
There's microphones everywhere.
Yeah, people on Zoom, if you can't hear questions, definitely let us know in the chat, and then we will make sure to repeat them going forward.
I'm seeing it's a tiny hard to hear audience questions, so folks asking questions out there, just speak up.
I'm not sure I even got the question. I don't think the life contract is going to be implemented in a clinical context.
Yeah, but I was saying, are there other sort of novel considerations that you have to take with psychedelic medications as opposed to traditional medications?
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. I think we don't even know fully what they might be, especially because they produce such dramatic effects so quickly that there are questions about, I think there was even a story that was kind of circulating a while ago about somebody that tried psychedelics and then in the wake of it decided they wanted a divorce. They were just done with their marriage. They realized they didn't like their spouse anymore. And is that a bad thing? It might have been an amazing thing. It might have been exactly what that person needed, but it's a fundamental and big change to their life. And how do you account for something? I mean, that's kind of the point, is you want something that produces these dramatic changes that really allows people to address what they're struggling with, but there's a price to be paid for that. And you could imagine if you were that person's spouse, they would say, oh, this is horrible. This psychedelic, they went and took a drug and now they think that their marriage isn't working. This is a poison. They went crazy. So there could be all kinds of blowback from events like that occurring. I mean, there's going to be some weird stuff to consider, and I don't think people have even begun to. Even I, and I think about this all day, every day. I haven't, fully figured out how exactly this is going to work.
Do you have another online one?
The life contract is an interesting example. I think that might be a little bit of a specific one, but I know one of the big buzzwords in the psychedelic medicine world generally is integration, integration, right? So you have the insights, you have the experience, and then when you wake up the next morning, what do you do with that? Maybe you choose to divorce your spouse and go through with that. Maybe you choose to work with therapists or guides to process your insights. So I think it's probably smart not to jump into any major life decisions too quickly following a trip, but yes, it's a good point. All right, we have a question from my former roommate, Frank.
Huh.
Frank, thanks for joining us. Let me see how to unmute you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we
We
can.
can.
I just remember
Awesome.
Thing.
Oh, go for it. Sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay, just very quickly, because also both Anne and Alexander Shulgin believed in psychogenic death, which I don't think is a real phenomenon, but it was, I think, like emblematic of their belief in the power of the human mind. Like, I do not think that there is strong evidence that people can will themselves into death, but they did. And this is like hotly debated. There certainly isn't strong scientific evidence. So this is also, I think, another issue with the life contract is I don't think there's really strong evidence that it's even possible for somebody to psychologically will themselves into death.
Frank,
Sorry.
you may now continue.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks for waiting. We're ready for you.
No, it's all good. I don't know. Hamilton, so awesome to hear from you. Look up to you a ton. Love all your content. On behalf of the community, thank you. Yeah, I'm a master's student right now, and I'm working on my thesis. I'm a mechanical engineer by trade, and right now I'm studying design. And my thesis has been about collaboration with non-human forms of sentience. And so the way that I've navigated this is by engaging with bamboo and consuming DMT in order to commune with bamboo and only work with it in the ways that it sees fit. And so there's like a whole ramble about how I've found that perhaps electricity is the bridge to across different forms of sentience. Electricity is this force that operates throughout the observable universe in a vast amount of context, including enabling like plants and mycelia and mammals and other forms of life that we may not even know exist to do the things that they do. And so I don't know, if you were curious to chat more about that, I would absolutely love to. I don't know how busy you are, but I'm curious how you feel about like the validity of engaging in psychedelics as a means to collaborate with other forms of life, the inert, the seemingly inert, the sentient, the seemingly sentient.
Yeah, I mean, certainly John Lilly investigated that quite a bit, and I don't know that he really concluded that psychedelics aided his ability to communicate with dolphins. He did not succeed in his efforts to teach dolphins to speak English, but he really tried, which is admirable. And he did use psychedelics in an attempt to facilitate the teaching of the dolphins English. But I think that was also being very hard on the dolphins. I think expecting them to speak English was setting the bar pretty high. But in terms of communication, it sort of depends on how you define communication. I don't know that. I know that some people have different beliefs. They believe in consciousness and everything, and I do not believe that. Like, I don't believe in communication with an inanimate object. So that is not something that I have thought about. And in terms of communicating with a plant, I mean, I think also there's something a little bit anthropocentric about these discussions, because it almost dismisses the way plants already have their own way of doing things, and they don't need to think about human styles of communication. Like, they have their own kind of complexity in their own world that exists completely independently of us. And they didn't really evolve to communicate with us, I don't think. So I feel that you can acknowledge the complexity of other organisms without needing to feel like you are in direct communion with them. But also, yeah, I'm not sure I fully understood the question. Yeah.
Open to engage further, but also don't know if other folks have questions.
We do have a few more questions, but maybe we can circle back afterwards, just so we can get through some other people.
Yep.
If that's okay.
Cool, cool. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, though, Frank. Yes, please go ahead.
So you mentioned the use of psychedelics as potentially medicinal for neurodegenerative disorders. And I'm thinking, how far along has the research come in considering the gut-brain nexus? And has there been any specific microbiome signatures associated with chronic psychedelic use?
I have not seen, I don't know if it's ever been studied, has it?
There are a couple of reviews and studies that have been published on it, however, it's not very extensive. So I'm wondering how.
On psychedelics in the microbiome?
Yes. That specifically psilocybin encourages or promotes the growth of Roseburia, and I believe it was lactobacillus. I'm not entirely sure, but
In vivo? Or this is like in some in vitro experiment they did?
it was a rodent model, I believe.
I did see that. Yeah, I haven't been following that. It's a really interesting idea. Yeah, I mean, and they're proposing that as a therapeutic mechanism of psychedelics.
That's what I'm asking. I'm not sure exactly how far along it's been to, or if there is a microbiome signature associated with psychedelic use.
Yeah, I mean, that would not be the explanation I would reach for in terms of explaining the therapeutic effect of psychedelics, but it's also something that really has not been studied all that much. I've seen a little bit of work on things like, like GABA biosynthesis being impacted by various things and how that could conceivably exert some kind of anxiolytic effect. But yeah, I don't think it's been studied all that much, and I don't follow the gut microbiome literature as carefully as I should, but it's really interesting. I'll look into it.
Cool. Do we have any more online questions?
We do. Yeah, so we have a hand up from Sasha. Sasha, I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi there, Hamilton. Big fan, first time caller. I just had a quick question about something that happened in season 2 of your show. Back at the start of season 3, you shared any and all, let's say, mistakes that you made throughout the course of your show, but you failed to mention the fact that you platformed Jerry Sandoval in season 2, the 5-MeO practitioner. For those who don't know, he stands accused of serious allegations involving sexual assault and other serious allegations. I was wondering if Hamilton would be willing to address the fact that he has yet to acknowledge this has happened.
No, I have not neglected. In fact, I acknowledged it earlier in this discussion. And the people that come after me with this stuff don't look at the timeline of events. At the time that I filmed that episode, none of that stuff was out. This whole like beware of bufo gangsters, bufo various malpractice.com stuff came after I filmed that. So it's just chronologically doesn't make sense. People are asking
for what it's worth, I've searched extensively and I did not know that you addressed it earlier in this session. I had just joined a few minutes ago. I'm glad that you did address it. However, I feel that it would be important for people to know that Sandoval should be avoided because of those allegations.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, this is also what I said earlier is that I actually borderline categorically don't trust a lot of these shamans in totally unregulated environments. It's just personally, it's never been a way that I have wanted to pursue these substances. I understand why people do that, but I advise not just caution with the people who have been widely criticized in the psychedelic community, but just in general. I mean, there was a big New Yorker article about Octavio Rettig recently, and it seems that the sorts of people who become sort of evangelists develop some kind of messiah complex, and they just go off the rails. But at the time that I was doing that, none of that stuff was out there. And for what it's worth, my experience with him was very positive. So that's another thing, it's really hard to be aware of these problems if your own experience is positive. If you contrast that with the Xenon clinic, so if you saw the Xenon episode, I don't know if you did, there was an instance where I saw problems right off the bat. It was very clear that in my own experience, something bad was happening. And I absolutely acknowledged that in the episode. And the clinic is now doesn't exist anymore. I can't help but feel a little bit guilty about it, but also I would have felt far more guilty if somebody had seen the episode and had died or something. And if I had known, which I did, that they were doing things that were medically questionable. So this is just a problem. I mean, you can only learn so much about somebody when you're interviewing them. And this is a thing that has happened to me repeatedly, sometimes for reasons that strike me as frivolous, sometimes for very real reasons, like the ones that you're describing with Jerry Sandoval. And yeah, it's one of the hard things about talking to people. And you can't do a full background search on everything they've ever done. You can do your best, but sometimes you end up talking to someone, and now the term that people use is platforming to make it sound like you did something bad. But in reality, you're just talking to somebody and you don't know the entirety of what they've done in their life, because it's hard to do that. Like, I don't know who you are. Maybe you've done something terrible, and someone will then come after me and say, how did I platform the guy who was trying to deplatform Jerry Sandoval? It's just, it never ends with this kind of stuff. So that's why I think that as cautious as people should be with these outed bad actors in the community, they should also just generally be very cautious and not categorically trust anybody that is doing this sort of work, because there's a lot of potential for harm that exists, especially in a completely unregulated environment.
Thank you for those comments, Hamilton. I do want to make it clear that the open letter regarding Dr. Jerry and Octavio had been publicly released before the start of your season 3 intro. If you'd like to share those links where you've denounced Jerry, then feel free to do so. I'd like to see that. That's
okay. That actually was not the point of that episode either. It was about factual errors. Anyway, you're coming after me in a sort of like aggressive way. You want me to do this, but clearly everyone involved in this community already knows. So if you want to hate me for not having dedicated an episode to disseminating this information, you're welcome to.
I'm not hating you, Hamilton. I'm simply asking a question. I'll leave it at that.
Sasha,
Hope you have a good day.
I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna move
No,
on
I've
to
seen
the
you
next
criticize me
question.
about this online in a bad faith way. So I just really don't think that you're approaching this from a real way. It's sort of self-aggrandizing. It's not really about helping people. It's about showing that you want to demonstrate that I'm a bad person because I haven't dedicated myself to publicly criticizing Jerry Sandoval. But the reality is that I haven't even seen all the things that he's done. I've spoken with the guy that runs the Bufal Various gangster Facebook group, and he had personal problems with Jerry Sandoval, arguments over money. I also spoke with somebody else. I investigated it as well as I could, and there was someone who had also money problems with him, and I didn't see anything that struck me as something that I needed to publicly tell people to never work with him, but maybe I missed something. And if you want to contact me privately in a friendly way, we can talk about it.
All right, so we're ready to move on.
Yeah.
All right. I know you've had your hand up in the back for a little bit.
So Compass Pathways came up in your work in Jason's lab. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that work and kind of how that works and maybe what you're working on.
Yeah. So, in terms of what's actually being clinically done right now, the emphasis is psilocybin, but a lot of these companies are doing preclinical basic science R&D work, not just Compass, but pretty much all of them. And that is what excites me most from a personal level. On a drug policy level, I'm excited by the possibility that the approval of these things will start to gradually erode the prohibition of psychedelics. But for a long time, especially in my life, there was no money whatsoever to study psychedelics. I've been working with Jason for 13 years, and for the first 12 of those years, we had to think about, the amount of solvents that we were using for each reaction. We were self-funding a lot of the research. There was the university that we work at actually just went out of business this year, and there was absolutely no support other than the existence of analytical instruments and things like that that were already present at the university. So we were doing a lot with nothing, and it was, we lost money, and it was a labor of love, and it was fun and charming in its own way. But there was always this feeling that if we actually had support, we could do 100 times as much as we were. And now that support exists, and it has attracted a number of chemists who've come specifically, because there's a lot of people out there that just want to do this, that never had the opportunity. There's a chemist from the Czech Republic who I work with, who's really brilliant, and she came just to work with Jason. And so, there's 4 people working full time, and we're making lots and lots of new tryptamine psychedelics, and doing, it's chemistry and pharmacology. That's what's going on. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, but it's all way, way, way preclinical. Nothing is, entering clinical trials or anything like that.
Sure.
Is it okay if I take some more in the room for a sec first? All right, go ahead.
And guys, please remember to speak up.
Oh yeah, just so the people on Zoom can hear.
Hi, Hamilton. Thanks for a great talk. I know you mentioned some of the implications of medicalizing psychedelics and possibly making things more industrial. And I know sometimes when certain drug classes go more on the industrial scale, there's a lot of investigation into how these drugs can be modified to produce more of the desired effect or curb side effects, for example. And I was wondering if psychedelics were to be more medicalized, what you thought about this sort of research, like if it should be more regulated, if you encourage it, or if things should be kept more traditional to the way that the established syntheses are now.
Well, ideally, I would like there to be maximal freedom. I think that the people always have this either or perspective of it's either got to be pharmaceutical, medical, or it's got to be decriminalized, legal, and it can't be one or the other, or it can't be both. But I think that what has happened with cannabis in New York City is close to the ideal. I mean, the ideal is we wouldn't have to worry about any of this, but in New York City, you have Marinol, which is an FDA-approved THC product that any physician can prescribe. And if they prescribe it to someone, they can travel to any state in the country and not worry about legal repercussions because it's federally legal. In addition to that, physicians can prescribe cannabis products that are produced in a regulated medical facility that have specific qualities. It has to be a vape, it can't be smoked plant material, and that's also good. And then on top of that, you have total legalization. So if people want to grow their own plants, they can do that. If people want to have some cannabis in their apartment, they can do that. If they want to sell some to their friends, they can do that as well. So that is everything. And that's what I think is ideal, is maximal freedom, not this fight of, oh, we've got to stop the pharmaceutical companies in the name of this, or we've got to, prevent the non-medical users because they're going to disgrace the pharmaceutical medical potential of these things. Like, ideally, it should all exist in harmony, and there should be maximal freedom for people to do whatever they want. It's hard to achieve, but it kind of is starting to happen, at least with cannabis in some places. So I think it's possible. And I think that's going to be ideal for psychedelics, is because you have people, like I think about, my mother or someone like that. She is afraid of psychedelics. She has anxiety. She's not going to want to use an unregulated psychedelic material, but if it were prescribed by a physician in a completely regulated environment, and she was being watched over by somebody who was, medically credentialed, I think she would feel comfortable doing that. That's obviously not the case for a lot of young people, or the sorts of people who are coming to listen to me talk about psychedelics. They probably are already really interested in this, and so they would probably feel comfortable just buying a psychedelic in an unregulated environment. So it's just, you want to have options available to different types of people so that they can extract the maximum benefit from the experience.
I know you've had your hand up for a bit. Yeah.
Thanks for coming to talk to us again. I had a question about EMP elves. I was watching videos and reading some articles on it. So I was curious, do you think the experience that people are having is because it's like a psychological effect, that they're reading articles and they're innately gonna experience maybe an elf in their trip? Or do you think like something more profound is happening with this experience, that a lot of these people are experiencing the same event when taking DMT?
I don't know. I mean, I think that there's an element of suggestion at play because people like to talk about DMT elves because it's funny and weird. And then you can ask your friend, did you see elves? And if everyone's talking about elves, then it's more likely that they're going to have a elven experience of one kind or another. And there's a famous story about what was it? I think it was Claudio Naranjo and Richard Evans Schultes. This is, I think, published in Tikal, where Naranjo thought that you had to have this jaguar communion with the ayahuasca vine, and if you hadn't had this jaguar communion, then it wasn't real ayahuasca. And Naranjo was talking with Schultes, and Schultes was saying, "Well, I just saw wiggly lines. I didn't see any jaguar." And he said, "Oh, well, which is clearly it wasn't ayahuasca that what you took." And he said, "Well, it was. In fact, I am the one that botanically named it." And so, I don't think you can expect people to have the same sorts of experiences. But if you exist in a culture, even in our culture, right? This is not just an indigenous framework. We live in a culture where people like Terence McKenna and talk about elves. And so that has an effect on the experience. Then, it will condition people to be more receptive to that sort of thing. But are you asking if I think the elves are real?
Oh, I don't know, maybe not.
I mean, I don't, but yeah.
Thank you. Do you think that there's a danger to medicalizing compounds that have historical or cultural importance? And is there a way that we can go about doing that in a respectful manner?
Yes. Yeah, but it depends on what you mean by respectful. Respectful to who?
I guess just like what takes into account the culture there, and that there might be one group that has this historical use for it that doesn't necessarily translate well to a mass market commodity.
Right. But what do you mean specifically? Like, what would be an example of this?
I guess kind of continuing on with your discussion about using synthesized chemicals as opposed to the toad thing, for example.
But that's not something that has like a real cultural attachment outside of Ken Nelson discovering it in the 80s in Texas.
Sorry, perhaps peyote is a better example.
Well, no one's even talking about medicalization of mescaline, interestingly. I don't think anyone's doing any mescaline-related trials. And mescaline has been largely neglected by the psychedelic renaissance for reasons that are not entirely clear to me. I think that the idea of whether or not it is respectful to a certain group is really up to that group to decide, and whether or not they want to weigh the cost benefit of potentially treating people who have serious diseases with this medicine and how that exists within their own culture. I mean, we do this all the time already. So many of our medicines, from quinine to I guess people don't use actual curare, but various derivatives of that were medically used for a long time with no thought whatsoever about the cultural context in which those medicines emerged. And I think the bigger issue there is the sort of biopiracy angle that I mean, those are really kind of stark examples of that occurring. But in terms of like how you would, I guess you're specifically asking like if mescaline were being used medically, how would that be done in a way that's maximally respectful to members of the Native American Church or something like that? Yeah. Well, interestingly, members of the Native American Church that I've spoken with don't even like the idea of mescaline. Like the very concept of mescaline is a idea that negates the fact that it is a plant spirit, and they have a fundamentally animist interpretation of the peyote. And so the idea of an active ingredient or a single alkaloid that is responsible for the effect is already at odds with the way they conceptualize the experience of peyote. And so it's possible that they wouldn't even consider that relevant to their practices, but that's, again, it's really up to them to decide what they think about something like that. I can't speak for the Native American Church, but with the way that these things are being medically implemented, there are elements of these cultures that have been integrated into the experiences. It's my impression that at Johns Hopkins that they have a chalice that they use. It's sort of similar to the copal burners that are used in Oaxaca, and that there was a mushroom icon that was placed in the rooms where the therapy was being done. That was like a kind of a replica of a Mesoamerican mushroom stone. And that I think was a way of you know, attempting to show some deference to the cultures that created these practices. Whether or not anyone would care about that or think that that's meaningful is another question. Like, I don't know if people in Oaxaca would say like, yes, that's great that you have a kind of copal burner. I have a feeling they wouldn't actually care at all.
Thank you.
We've had a question right here.
Yeah.
Wow.
Hi, Hamilton. I'm wondering if you have any experience with, in your research, with psychedelics being used to treat mind-body disorders. For example, conversion disorder, formerly known conversion disorder, it's now known as functional neurological disorder. The idea is the signals being sent through the nervous system are blocked, possibly due to trauma. There's a whole lot of theories around it, but it's not really known what causes it. But the symptoms could be blindness, paralysis, weakness, loss of hearing. And the idea is that the block, that's what the neurologists say, needs to be undone, and then the body will continue to function as normal.
Interesting. I mean, you clearly know a lot more about this than I do. So
I have that. I have the diagnosis.
okay. Sounds possible to me. I mean, I get this kind of thing all the time where people say, do you think psychedelics work for X disorder, or has it been examined for X disorder? And all I can say is, you know, seems possible. I mean, there's a lot. If you go into the, you know, in the 1960s, people, for better or worse, in many instances for worse, were able to do experiments with drugs on people with very little regulation. And one product of that was that people looked at psychedelics for really unusual things, including there's an entire book that's LSD and Ritalin combined for treatment of psoriasis in like a child. So they're injecting this child with huge amounts of Ritalin and LSD, and the results are miraculously positive. That I have no idea why this combination of Ritalin and LSD was used. You know, whether or not this study was ethical is, I think it's pretty clear that it was wouldn't be considered ethical by today's standards. But that was, people had the freedom to sort of explore these potential hypothetical disorders, and it's just it's not easy to examine things like that. There's so much regulation, which is good. You know, it's good that any person can't just say, I think I'm going to try injecting a high dose of psilocybin to treat X disorder. And they have to really justify the research and make sure that everybody is adequately informed before they participate in that sort of research in a medical context. But I think that as the field opens up, people will begin to cautiously reinvestigate these more speculative areas like the one that you described. And it's possible that in some of these areas, they'll have a really prominent therapeutic effect.
Yeah, go
Oh,
Sorry, I promise I'll call on you next.
this is a question from my friend who's in Switzerland right now. They wanted to ask a question. You want to know a little bit more about your career, and specifically how did you get started with documentary filmmaking? I think you studied anthropology and chemistry. What made you decide to get into media? And were there any sort of major challenges that you came across initially trying to make that jump?
I didn't really decide. I was really mostly interested in writing at the beginning, but this was during the time when there was like the great pivot to video occurring. And it had become clear to all these different media outlets that if you could make a video, this is actually before YouTube, believe it or not, that this all started. And not before YouTube existed, but before this stuff was going on to YouTube, and it didn't really exist in the same way that it does now. But even then, people realized, you know, an article is going to be read by a few thousand people, maybe 100,000 people if you're lucky. But if you do a video right, it can be tens of millions. And so when I was 21, I started making these videos because they asked me to, not because I was saying, oh, I really, really want to make videos. And what was interesting, I really was only interested in writing. But suddenly, if I wanted to write about something, I could get the money to do it if I made a video as well. And so I kind of fell into it And for the first ones that I made, it was all very casual. I was just making them. It was insanely cheap, being made with really one person who's holding a camera. This is also like mini DV tapes quite a while ago, and that was it. We edited them quickly and put them online. A lot of them were basically jokes, and then they were successful, especially once they started going on YouTube, and it became clear that that was a really good way of telling these stories, and I started to embrace it.
Would you mind if I jumped in? Thinking about your show, what is your favorite or most memorable scene or episode that you've done of Hamilton's Pharmacopeia?
My favorite scene is, well, is probably the MDMA synthesis in the Steve Gill episode, because that was something that was really extraordinarily difficult and was kind of a dream for me because I've always thought it would be so amazing to film, clandestine synthesis of different drugs and tell the chemistry stories that way, but also show people the actual chemistry. And it's really hard and really dangerous for people to do that. And there's a lot of responsibility that comes with even if somebody says, yeah, come into my MDMA lab, film me making MDMA, and which was the case with the person in that episode. And then it became clear to me as we were filming it that this person was using an enormous amount of their own MDMA and was not adequately gauging the risks that they were taking, not just by inviting us into their lab, but with their general conduct in doing this in this sort of criminal enterprise. But he was a brilliant guy, but was just not cautious. And it was sort of frightening for me because I really didn't want to do anything that could get him in trouble. And yet he was showing us something that was so remarkable. And it was very difficult to film. It was dangerous to film. And I think that it also demonstrates the chemistry in a really satisfying way. Even editing it was very difficult. So there was a huge amount of work that went into that. And then I later became friends with that chemist. And then he tragically killed himself a couple of years ago. And so it's a kind of like a memory of him. And, I had this weird experience of showing it to his mother after he died and, saying like, you probably don't know this about your son, but he was really proud of this work that he did making MDMA. And this was a huge part of his life. And she watched the videos of him making MDMA and was proud of him for it. And so, yeah, I think that has a kind of emotional resonance.
I think she just wants to ask a question really quick before she hits up.
I have a really sweet question. Can I just take a quick picture? I'm a really big fan. Been watching this since like high school.
Yeah, go for it. Yeah.
Come on up.
Oh, somebody want to take
Yeah. You can come up here if you want.
This
Yeah,
is a
don't
bold.
worry.
I'm sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. Yeah.
Catching this live.
I just had a good question, and maybe this will be more sifted through as like psychedelics become more acceptable and there's more FDA like clinical trials that will go on. But do you think that the different psychedelics, the route of administration, the type of route of administration will determine like a different effect on the person?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that's the interesting thing is sometimes people will say, oh, I tried Golden Teacher and it was so different from Treasure Coast, or if you put lemon juice in, it's so different. And again, they're usually using some kind of like entourage effect type explanation for this or something like that. But everything impacts everything in psychopharmacology. The rapidity of the onset changes the nature of the experience. I mean, the obvious example would be the intranasal esketamine, which is designed in two different ways to minimize the duration of the experience. So on top, first you have the intranasal route, which is going to make it faster, at least than oral. I suppose it's slower than IV or IM, but the S enantiomer is also metabolized more quickly. So this is all designed to reduce the duration of the experience. And duration plays a big role in what can occur. I mean, this is, people talk about smoke DMT and ayahuasca as if they're completely different things, but the major difference there is duration. The beta carboline alkaloids, if you go that route, do also color the experience, of course, but duration, I think, is the fundamental thing that's at play. And there's a lot of ways to calibrate the experience of even these known compounds with small modifications of how they're administered.
I guess I'll ask a question. Wait, does anybody else have a hand?
I have a question. What do you see as the most important advocacy groups going forward? Is it medicine, business people, patients, like veterans, or different kinds of patients?
Veterans are extremely important because this is kind of one of the problems. I was just, before I came here, I was talking with my friend, Mike Cunningham, who is a chemist and pharmacologist at Columbia, or was at Columbia, and he's planning an open letter to protest the prohibition of DOI. And we were going over his open letter, and he's talking about psychedelic medicines, and I was thinking like, oh, is it even okay to say psychedelic medicines? Should we say 5-HT2A agonists in the use of psychiatric disorders because these people are conservative and we want to not frighten them with the wrong language? And this is something that MAPS has done strategically in a really smart way, is cultivating bipartisan support from conservative groups like veterans that are not always conservative, but sometimes are. And they received a lot of criticism for that, but I think that ultimately it has been a really smart move, because you don't want this to be a purely counterculture thing. You want as many people you want as many different types of people as possible, ideally. So it's not really one group. Ideally, you'd have representatives from all sorts of different groups, because each has their own power and their own ability to represent their interests, whether it's indigenous people or veterans or business people or just normal people as well. Like, in terms of these scheduling actions, every person here has the ability to go on the Federal Register website, and I encourage you to do so, and write why you think DOI and DOC should not be prohibited. And you don't need to go into a long rant about it or be a medical doctor or credentialed and working in a lab. You can just say, I believe that these things are useful for treatment of inflammation based on this study, and I think that prohibiting them would be bad for scientific research. So everyone can do their part to oppose this. And so, yeah, I don't think there's any single group, but I'm also aware that having money behind this is probably going to help. And I've said this before, and then people criticize me for it. Like, I'm saying that that's the way it should be. It's, to be clear, it is not the way it should be, but it is the way it is. And if you have lots of people, I mean, this also happened with cannabis, not the way it should be, but it's the way it happened. You had people, protesting the prohibition of cannabis for decades, very, very aggressively and actively, with great passion and sacrificing for it. But it seems that it was when these commercial interests were introduced that suddenly there was enough muscle behind the movement that people really were changing the laws. So, yeah.
Thank you. You've covered drugs now for a very long time. I'm kind of curious, in your interactions with people, how you've seen, perspectives shift over the years.
Well, I think there's trends. There are these trends that emerge, and it's annoying to me because I feel like the trends are always weirdly wrong. When I first became interested in this, it was very shamanically oriented, and Daniel Pinchbeck was very popular. And if you wanted to show that you cared about psychedelics, you would go to a retreat in South America and have an authentic experience with an indigenous group. And that was how you signified that you were a serious psychedelic enthusiast. Then the interest moved toward microdosing became huge, which also I found sort of annoying. And then everyone was talking about microdosing, and the point of psychedelic experience became stripping all of the psychedelic activity out of it. And I couldn't understand why everyone was so seduced by that concept, but they definitely were, including my parents. I mean, I remember I've talked to my dad about psychedelics endlessly, and it wasn't until people started saying that they weren't psychedelic and could be used non-psychedelically that he suddenly was really interested in them. And then, of course, with the publication of How to Change Your Mind, there was a huge emphasis on medicalization, and this should be in a medical model, which I think is fine as long as you recognize that that's not everything, that it is part of the puzzle. Like, I'm very much pro-medicalization, but I don't like the idea that that's the only way of thinking about these things. They're clearly much more than medicines in like the strict sense, yeah. Oh, and now the trend, of course, is anti-corporate virtue signaling. That has become the dominant mode of discussing psychedelics. So if you want to show that you're a serious psychedelic enthusiast, you say that you hate X or Y corporation, or you're very critical of MAPS, and this has become extremely fashionable. It's actually become one of the dominant ways that people talk about psychedelics, so this kind of like hand-wringing over the psychedelic industrial complex and how terrible this is going to be. And if people have concerns about that, that's totally valid, and I think it's fine. But I just hope they recognize that this is such a small issue compared to prohibition. Like, I have friends who are in prison right now, and I just can't imagine that they are in a fucking cage thinking like, oh, how terrible it might be if somebody makes some money off of psychedelics. Like, they want to be free. The laws need to be changed. And on top of that, in 2021, more people died of drug overdoses than any other year in recorded history. So like, they're just big problems that I feel like, and of the ongoing prohibition that nobody talks about. So it's like, sure, if you want to wring your hands about like, will we be commodifying the sacred? Like, fine, go for it. But it just doesn't seem like the biggest issue right now.
Yeah.
Any more questions?
Just a quick
Since you haven't
question.
asked
So I'm finishing up a degree in structural biology here, and I have a lot of interest in psychoactive compounds and how they bind to different receptors. Do you have any advice for going into that sort of field of science, just from your perspective as a chemist?
Yeah, other people in the lab that I work in do a lot of that kind of stuff, and I don't do any of it at all. They have a VR headset, and I look at models of the 5-HT2A receptor and think about it a little bit, but I do have this kind of outdated Shulgin style thought about this, like, oh, it can't really be that predictive. Like, really, it's just got to be trial and error. That's the only way that this is ever going to truly work, and that is not smart. Like, I'm aware that I'm thinking about this in a stupid way, but it's just my kind of romantic thought about that it will ultimately be a serendipitous discovery that really contributes, not some kind of hyper sophisticated rational drug design. And of course, Brian Roth is doing all of this work in that vein, but I've heard that like preliminarily it has not yielded a new scaffold yet. Apparently they presented some of it at ACS, and it was basically a conformationally constrained tryptamine. So yeah, but tons of people are doing that sort of work. Like, I know a really brilliant chemist at a company called Camtech who got his PhD under David Nichols, and that's all he does. He lives in Brazil, doesn't have a lab, and he just spends his time with a VR headset designing drugs based on the structure of these different receptors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
That's very interesting. Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, so I'm more familiar with sort of things like cancer therapy, where they'll use combination therapy, combinations of different antibodies. I was wondering, in the psychedelic space, we talk a lot about single drugs, or at least that's what I'm familiar with. Ketamine, this, that, but I imagine there must also be some combinations of drugs that are interesting to explore. Are there any out there that you found to be particularly interesting or have great potential?
well, I mean, the obvious one would be an MAOI of some kind combined with a tryptamine of some kind, ayahuasca, but also really any simple tryptamine can be combined with an MAOI, and it will create a more potent effect, whether it's DET or DIPT or DP or DET or whatever. It really doesn't matter, and that has not been explored all that much. Problem is that multi-drug therapies are pretty uncommon in, at least in psychiatry, it's pretty uncommon. There's, what is that, pseudobulbar affect disorder, combination of dextromethorphan and quinidine. There's a couple things that have been approved that way, but I think it complicates things from a regulatory perspective. And, it's already complicated enough introducing one drug into the human body, and then when you have to think about potential drug-drug interactions, it gets really, really tricky to think about. But I mean, if you look at, Arrowhead, there's a lot of people exploring combinations of different drugs that think that they've found, the most amazing thing ever. And I get emails about this sort of thing all the time where people say, oh, I discovered it, I found it. It's like the ultimate therapeutic psychedelic experience is a combination of 2CB and deschloroketamine and nitrous oxide and 5-MAPB. And if you combine these things in this ratio, you will see God. And I think like, yeah, probably. I mean, I don't know. It seems plausible, but I don't know that that's safe or something that should be promoted. And at the very least, it's complicated. Yeah.
So I got one more question and then maybe we want to start wrapping up.
Yeah, that makes
Well,
sense.
We're here at the Johns Hopkins University. We're in an audience of students with aspirations and bright eyes looking into the future of the psychedelic world, some hoping to work in the psychedelic world. There aren't that many model pathways to follow right now. And you've obviously done a really good job of being creative and enterprising and creating your own path. So just want to kind of leave the question open of like what advice you'd give to students or young folks who want to break into this world as a professional.
Yeah, that's the question I get asked the most, and it's the one I have the worst answer for, or no answer for. And I feel bad, but it's because people say like, I'm really interested in this. What do I do? What should I do? And all I can think is, well, I don't know you. I don't know what you like. I don't know what you're good at. I don't know anything about you. But I think the bottom line is that at this point, there's something for almost everyone. Obviously chemistry, medicine, psychiatry, psychology have really important roles in all of this, but also art and technology, and music. And it's hard to think of something that doesn't, and journalism. But I mean, all of these things have a way of being integrated into the movement in a constructive way. So I think the real question is what people are interested in, what they're good at, what they think they could do. And I remember asking that question myself. I remember Julie Holland spoke at the New School when I was a student there. And I said the same thing, like, how do I get involved in this? And she said, oh, you have to go to medical school. And I thought, like, I don't know if I want to do that though. I kind of am interested in doing like an Alexander Shulgin kind of thing, like making new psychedelics. And that was at that time, it was like, no, that's not a thing that you can do. You can't make new psychedelics. But then I found Jason Wallach, and he was making new psychedelics, and we started making new psychedelics together. And it was an amazing collaboration that continues to this day. So I think it's important to think about what you want, what would make you happy. And then of course I also did the journalism stuff as well, because that also seemed like a good way to contribute to all of this through storytelling and education. So you don't have to choose one path. It could be anything, but I guess just it really depends on what people are interested in. Yeah.
Okay. We have a message here saying, Hamilton, I will work for you for free 6 days a week. Let me know. I will do whatever.
That's nice. Okay.
Yeah, so thank you so much to everybody for coming and checking this out today. And also obviously thank you to you, Hamilton, for coming and speaking with us. I think everybody had a really great time. And yeah, I hope everybody checks this out. We're going to record this, and if anybody wants to watch it back, just review anything that was said, feel free. We'll send that link out, and I'll send it to you if you want to make it available to anybody. And we'll most likely post it on YouTube or some sort of platform like that, so it's accessible. But yeah, this was really great. Thanks, everybody.
All right, thanks for joining, folks. And we have our next event on May 5th in the same room with Dr. Bill Richards, talking about sacred knowledge, magic mushrooms, and the role of spirituality in psychedelic healing. So hope to see you guys there. Send us an email for the recording if you want it. And feel free to hang around, come talk. We've got this room booked for the night. So thanks everyone for coming, and thanks folks on Zoom. Hope you all have a good night.